Hi, everyone. Welcome. I hope you are all doing well this evening. My name is Suzanne Mose, and I'm the head of curatorial services here at the Niagara Falls Museums. Before we get moving on tonight's program, I would like to take a minute to acknowledge that the Niagara region is located on the traditional shared territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Chinook peoples. The Chinook people have called these lands home for thousands of years, and more recently, the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee have been sharing the land as one dish, one spoon treaty territory. So with those very important and relevant words being said, I'd like to thank you all very much for joining us for the second of 4 talks in this speaker series. My colleague Darcy Belanger will be your host this evening. Darcy works with us here at the museum as our Indigenous programs coordinator, and it's only through his hard work and his generosity that we've been able to put this series together. So my deepest gratitude and appreciation goes out to Darcy. And just before I hand it over to Darcy and our guest this evening, I just have a quick housekeeping point or two. And that's just to let you know that at the end of tonight's presentation, there's going to be a chance for questions and answers. So I really hope you can stick around for those. And when we get to that stage of the evening, I ask that you use the Q&A function that you should see on your screen, either at the top or the bottom of your screen, depending on what device you're using. And also throughout the evening, we are going to leave the chat function open, but that's more for yourselves as participants to chat amongst yourselves during the evening. So again, Q&A at the end after Brian's finished, and just use the Q&A button that you should see on your screen. So that's it. Thanks again for joining us. I'm going to hand it over to Darcy. He'll be your host this evening, like I said, and he'll introduce our guest, Brian Kahn.
Hi, thank you very much, Susan. Welcome, everybody. And if you joined us last week, it's an honor to have you back and to take in and listen to our next speaker, who is an amazing gentleman. And for our newcomers, thank you so much for joining us. And we hope that we could carry on and walk through this journey and get to hear more speakers throughout the rest of June. So tonight is Brian Kahn, and Brian Kahn is a leader within the Metis Nation and within the local Indigenous community. He is the chair of the Niagara Region Métis Council and sits on the Niagara Indigenous Community Advisory Board, focused on reducing homelessness of the Indigenous peoples. He is an ambassador for the Celebrations of Nation, an annual Indigenous cultural celebration held here in St. Catharines. Brian was on the organizing committee for the Landscape of Nations, a tribute to the role Indigenous peoples played in the War of 1812. And right now, I would like to bring in Brian. Brian, are you with us?
All right, can everyone, or can you hear me okay? So,
yes.
Tansi, Brian Etchishikashan, Niagara Falls, Nuekin. Natanesco Wakamakana Kilinawak, Mashkagewak Ekwa Maytee. So hello everyone, good evening. My name is Brian. I live in Niagara Falls, and my ancestors though, they come from the north, they come from the far north. They are the Moose Cree or the Mashkagewak, and I am Maytee. And I want to thank the museum for giving me this opportunity to speak to you tonight, and to be the second speaker in the 4 Directions series. The second direction is the East, and talking about new beginnings, start of a new day, start of a new people, and that's really who the Métis people are. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and get into my presentation. You're going to have to stop sharing your screen. There we go. And all right, so I do want to start this evening though by thanking the Creator and for the many gifts that He's given us. And I ask that we all come together into a common place of understanding, of love, hope, and of unity as people on this land that is known as Turtle Island. And so I welcome you to this presentation. A little bit more about myself. I am a father, I'm a grandfather, I'm a husband, I'm a brother, I'm an uncle. firekeeper for the Celebration of Nations. And Darcy gave you a bit of an intro of who I am as well. But I'm also an artist. So part of this presentation, I will take you through just a little bit of some of the art that I do. And here's a sample of one sort of during the process of actually developing it. But my journey begins on this land, well, thousands of years ago. But as a Maytee person, there is a European connection. And so this is paying homage to my English ancestors who came over here. Now, this gentleman on this tombstone is actually the grandson of the first person who came over from the Vincent line from England. He became the Archdeacon of the Anglican Church. And he did very well for himself. The unfortunate thing was, and as you'll learn as we go through this presentation, the Metis have not always been the people of choice on this land. And as a matter of fact, he was very limited as far as how far he could actually go within the church because he was a half-breed. And so that definitely worked against him. And if you look at this photograph here, he's actually the gentleman on the left with the he's in the dark coat on the very outer side of the photograph. So he's already the third generation on this land as a half-breed or as a Métis. As I go through this presentation, I also want you to realize that this is a no blame zone. Some of the things I'm going to say might come across as harsh, but they are the reality of what happened to the Indigenous people throughout the history of this land, especially since it became shared with the European settlers. And so anything that is said tonight is not intended to make anyone feel bad. You weren't there at the time. It wasn't your fault. And so I want you to move forward with that, but also learn. The only way that we can actually truly move forward is if we learn what happened in the past and make sure that we don't repeat some of those mistakes. And certainly with some of the things that are going on in the news today and around the world, we're very aware of some of the challenges that are faced by people of different color, different races. So on this land, we refer to it now as North America, but for the Indigenous people of this land who have been here for thousands of years, it was known as Turtle Island. And in fact, we know that there have been people for at least 10,000 years on this land. These drawings and these etchings that were found in Alberta have been carbon dated back to about 10,000 years. But I know other work has been done, and there's actual proof of a longer history on this land. So there's a rich heritage here, but I'm not going to spend my time talking about the time before the European settlers came and before the explorers came, but I do want to start at that point. So around 1492, a gentleman by the name of Christopher Columbus, he had some funding from the King and Queen of Spain. He also had the blessing of the Pope of the time, and that was Alexander VI, to go out and to find new lands. He was hoping to find the new trade route to India, but along the way they knew that there was the potential of finding new land. And under the Pope, there was a decree known as the Doctrine of Discovery. And basically what the Doctrine of Discovery is that as the explorers started to go out, as they found new lands, if they found the land to be uninhabited, then it was free for them to claim in the name of the church, in the name of the king and queen that had funded them. And so that's what Christopher Columbus did. Now, you have to understand that the definition of what made land inhabited was based on whether or not there were Christians on the land. So if the land had people on it, but if they were not Christian, then it was considered to be uninhabited. And so therefore it was free for the taking as far as claiming it as a new land for, in this case, Spain. So when the Indigenous people discovered Christopher Columbus on their shores, they initially welcomed him and they welcomed the other explorers who followed him. Many of them came in, they were not well, they spent a long time on the ocean, and as a result they were quite sick. And so the Indigenous people went out to these floating islands with these great white clouds that moved them. and welcomed them and helped them and nursed them back to health. And so it started out as a positive relationship. As it transitioned, more and more explorations happened, but once they were doing the explorations, they not only realized that there was this vast land that was here, but there were also resources that were no longer available in Europe or that were scarce in Europe. So things like the furs, that many of the animals that had become extinct or wiped out in Europe were now found here on this new land. And so it opened up a whole new door of trade and industry. And one thing that we have to realize is in the land that we call Canada, the fur trade was the strongest. So it was strongest in the north. And there's a distinct difference in the relationship of the settlers as they came in onto this land, and the land that became known as Canada versus that was known as the United States. In the US, they didn't have a fur trade. So the indigenous people of the land at the time were really just an interference. As the settlers were coming in and wanting to claim more and more land and harvest more land, the native people of the land at the time were just in their way. But in Canada, we had this fur trade and it was vibrant. And so the indigenous people were going out, they were collecting the furs, they were bringing it back, they were trading it with the Europeans. The Europeans were taking those to Europe. New fashions and new industries came out of that. And then new products were brought back to this land. And so it was a good working relationship. And it lasted for a couple of 100 years. So it was an exciting time. The War of 1812 happened. As Darcy said, I was part of a group that actually created a monument to honor the indigenous people who participated in the War of 1812. And many indigenous nations, especially in this area, fought strong and hard beside the Brits. And truly, if it wasn't for the indigenous people, the War of 1812 probably would have had a very different outcome. It really was the knowledge of the land, the way to track and to follow one another, and a little bit of unconventional battle was also done by the indigenous people. So as a result of that, the indigenous people were a strong part of the War of 1812. From the War of 1812, though, as the decades moved on, Canada started to form itself into a country. And as it did, the British North American Act came in and Canada was being formed, but it was very different than the Canada that we see today. Here, obviously a map of Canada, and what you can see in this photograph is actually the many treaties that were being formed along the way. They weren't all formed around the time of Canada being formed, because again, not all the provinces joined at the same time. So some of the treaties happened at different times. But if you see how the treaties went, most of them were along, especially the older treaties, were along the Canada-US border. So there was a reason for doing that. By giving the land, setting it aside for the indigenous people, Canada was using that as a way of blocking the United States from coming further north. So it was strategic in what they were doing by setting up these reserves. Now, the other thing that was done at the time, around when Canada was being formed, actually a little bit later, this is 1876. So about 10 years after Canada was formed, the Indian Act came into effect. And the Indian Act is still in effect today. It actually is what defines who are the First Nation people on this land. This is the cover of a book, and it's an excellent book if you have any interest in Indigenous people and want to learn about First Nations in particular, and how Canada formed itself and some of the limitations that were actually put in place under the Indian Act. Under the Indian Act, the First Nations people were limited to the reserves. They couldn't leave the reserves without permission from the Indian agent, and in fact had to carry a document to say that they were allowed to leave the land. They were told what they could harvest. So they were told when and how and what they could actually harvest as far as animals. But then as the settlers wanted the indigenous people to get more involved in agriculture, they also controlled what plants were being planted by the First Nation people. And with that, as they tried to sell and trade them, the Indian agents actually set the prices. And so it was actually quite unfair, because the settlers were able to sell their goods at higher prices than what the First Nations people were. So this was really, the Indian Act was really all about controlling the First Nations people. Under the Indian Act, the First Nations people actually were not considered Canadians until 1950. And it wasn't until 1960 that the First Nation people were actually allowed to vote for the very first time. So again, this is a cover of a book, but it's talking about the Indian Act, and it's fascinating to see exactly how the government of the time was really wanting to control the Indigenous people. If we look at who make up the Indigenous people, sometimes the term Aboriginal is used, sometimes Indigenous. The difference is actually Indigenous is the preferred term. It is a term that describes the First Nations, the Maytee, and the Inuit people. Aboriginal does as well, but Aboriginal is actually a term that was intended for those from Australia. And so just as when Columbus came to this land and saw the dark-skinned people, he thought he found India. And so he called the people that he found Indians, and that name has stuck ever since. The term Aboriginal, for the same reason, has carried over from Australia. So it's not really the term that's preferred, but it is in a lot of the documents. And as a result of that, you'll still see the term Aboriginal used, and it's used correctly when it's referring back to things like Canada's Constitution or the Indian Act. They're referred to as Aboriginals in there as well. But with the Indigenous people, there are three groups, and the first is the First Nations. They truly are the first people of this land. Again, cave drawings and etchings prove that they've been here for at least 10,000 years. Other items have proven tens of thousands of years, even longer ahead of that. Today, there's about 600 different First Nations on the land that we call Canada. So it's a very diverse group of people. And so while it's one term that's used to describe them, you cannot use one approach. My heritage is Moose Cree. As the land acknowledgement was said at the very beginning, there are the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe people. Their traditions, their teachings, their way of thinking well, there's similarities, but there's also a lot of differences. And so you have to look at the First Nation people and really realize that it's a diverse group, even though they're under one classification. The next first people of the land are the Inuit. And the Inuit are the people of the north. They too are also the first people of this land. It's uncertain as to when they actually got here, but it's interesting to know that Canada is not the only country that has Inuit people. So Alaska, obviously for the land connection, there's Inuit in Alaska, but also Greenland and Russia also have Inuit people. So it's the circumpolar area of the world is where the Inuit people are. It's uncertain how the people first got onto this land, although the Inuit, there is credible stories of them using the landmass or the land bridge to come across. But it didn't happen in a day, it didn't happen in a week or even years. It may have taken hundreds, if not even thousands of years for that transfer from one continent to the other. And it wasn't, there wasn't a destination in mind. What they were doing was following the herds or following the resources that they were living off of. And as those herds moved further away, they eventually came onto this land. So the Inuit are a unique group of individuals. They are separate from the First Nations. And in fact, the Indian Act is the one document that truly separates the First Nation people from the Inuit and the Maytee. So the Maytee are the third group that are listed in Canada's Constitution. And we're, you could say, a new people. We've been around since the late 1600s. I had heard a joke at one point is, when was the first Maytee person on this land? And the answer is 9 months after the first ship arrived. But that's not actually true. While the men were coming across and marrying and having children with the women of this land, the first children that were born from those unions were not really known as Maytee. They were known as half-breeds or mixed bloods, but they weren't known as the Maytee. That didn't happen until about the mid-1700s. So there was a good 150 years of these intermarriages and mingling of families before the Maytee people actually formed. Now, while there are 3 separate groups of nations that make up the Indigenous people of Canada, there are some similarities that we all share. With the Metis, yes, we have that mixed heritage. So I do start my presentation also talking about the First Nations people, because that is who the Metis are. They started out as First Nations or Indigenous people of this land, and then through marriage and interrelationships, the children then became the mixed bloods. One of the things that is relatively recent in the way of talking about Indigenous people is the Indian residential schools. And oftentimes when people talk about the Indian residential schools, they only talk about the First Nation people. And they don't realize that the Inuit and the Metis were also a big part of the Indian residential schools. And in fact, the Metis, the goal of the Indian residential schools was actually to get the First Nation children. It was to kill the Indian and the child is ultimately what they were trying to do. But if they picked up Métis children, the Métis children weren't covered by the Indian Act. And without the Indian Act and the reserves, there wasn't the financial support. So if the Indian agents went out in the fall and they gathered in children, and if when they got to the schools, they realized that some of these children were Métis, they didn't let the kids go. There was still that Indian factor that they were trying to get rid of. So they kept them. But the Métis, because they didn't have the reserves, because there wasn't the Indian Act that covered the Métis, the children were actually a liability to the schools. And so they were often used as placeholders. And as it is, the children were often moved to schools that were far, far away from where their families were, their communities were. But the Métis were moved from school to school to school. As more First Nation children were brought in, there was funding. And so then the children were replaced with the First Nations who had the funding. The Métis were moved to another school to be placeholders. So the story of the Métis children was actually in many ways worse than what happened with the First Nation children. And any little bit of education that did happen in the Indian residential schools was only for the First Nation children. It wasn't for the Métis children. The 60s scoop is another part of Canada's history. So as the Indian residential was closed in 1996, there were about 150,000 children went through the school system, and in 130 years of the schools being in place. In 1996, the last one actually closed in Saskatchewan, but they still had this Indian problem. And so one of the things that they started to do was take the children, and rather than putting them into school, they would take them from the families, not just put them into foster homes, they would actually take them and have them adopted out. And the location of where they were adopted was anywhere around the world. So when you do your DNA testing, and if you find that you have some Indigenous heritage, but yet you thought you were Italian or Scottish, there's a chance that as the Indigenous people were taken back across the ocean, that you may actually have some First Nation or Indigenous blood in you as well. But these children were taken away, and if you can see the wording in this ad, I often liken it to an ad that you might find for a puppy. They're really describing the children or the child. In some cases, they talk about the condition of their teeth. So it's quite, it's not a friendly way of adopting out the children. Sadly, within Canada today, even without the 60s scoop, the Indigenous children make up more than 50% of the children that are in care in the system. And yet, the children that are from ages 0 from birth to 14, they're only 7% of that population. Yet they make up 50% of the population who are actually in care. So what happens if a family gets in trouble, and if they're in, the children are away. The resources are rarely given to the family to try to cope or get through this the situation. The faster solution is just to take the child away. These days, many children just end up in the foster system. But during the 60s in particular, these children were actually just adopted out. And again, it was anywhere around the world. So we'll jump back to when the settlers and the explorers came to this land. Again, it was a good relationship in the very beginning. The men that were coming over, and it was just men that were coming over, they needed the women. They needed them for companionship, but they also needed them. They came to this land wearing funny clothes, funny shoes. They didn't know what foods to eat. They didn't know where the first sources were or the other resources were. And so it was the women who actually took the men by the arm and actually led them through that time. And so it's obvious then from that children were born. And as I said, that the first generations that actually happened as the explorers were coming to this land, they weren't really known as the Maytee at that point. They were known as the half-breeds, the mixed bloods. There's another slide that will give you a whole list of other names that the Maytee people are known as. But if we look at who the Maytee are themselves, by definition, the Maytee are a distinct, and here's the term, Aboriginal people. We have our own unique history, our own culture, language, and territory. There was specific land that was set aside or that the Maytee people actually lived on for centuries. But we followed the waterways. We started basically in Ontario and moved westward as the fur trade was progressing and as animals were being depleted in the east here, there was more and more movement towards the west. According to the National Council of the Maytee, a Maytee is any person who actually self-identifies as being Maytee, and that is someone who's distinct and separate from any of the other Aboriginal people. And they have to be accepted by the Metis Nation. But what's critical in this definition is that there's a historic connection to the land. So you may be someone who has a First Nations aunt or grandmother or great-grandmother that's in your history. That doesn't make you Maytee. The Maytee are the people that were here, and those unions and those children that were born prior to colonization or prior to Canada becoming a country. And so that's the distinct difference of what makes up a Maytee person versus someone who is of mixed heritage. Now, what gets a little confusing is that in those first generations, and even after that, oftentimes the women would end up going back to their communities. And so there are many people who are of mixed heritage who do not claim to be Maytee, but who have really the same definition of a background that the Maytee people have. So it really comes down to whether you claim your Maytee heritage or not. But certainly there are many people who are of First Nation heritage today that have European ancestors in their background. As the fur trade happened on this land, there were two companies in particular that were the strongest. It was the Hudson Bay Company, still exists today, obviously, and the Northwest Company. And in 1836, the two companies merged. When I looked at my ancestry and looked at the records of my grandfather, my first grandfather, when he came to this land, he was 13 years old. It was the first Thomas Vincent. This tombstone was his grandson that I showed earlier. But the first Thomas Vincent was 13 years old when he came. He worked for the Hudson Bay. He was a writer. So he had some education. And from what I can tell, although we have no connection with the family in England, I guess they were fairly well off. And that was proven by the fact that he was so well educated. He worked his way through the system. He worked his way through the Hudson Bay. He was a fur trader. He became a factor, became a postmaster. In fact, on my in-laws' property in Brandon, Manitoba, on my father-in-law's property, my father-in-law's family has been on that land for about 140 years, multi-generations on the land. And Brandon House, which is one of the trading posts that my first grandfather actually oversaw, was actually on the land that is now owned by my in-laws. But in 1836, the Hudson Bay and the Northwest Company merged together, and my grandfather, Thomas Vincent, was the one who was given the duty of looking at the postmasters and which one was successful. Along the way, where the Hudson Bay set up a trading post, the Northwest Company had a trading post right across the river. And that was just the way it was historically. So when I looked at the records trying to find my own ancestry, there was always a French name associated with it. And the Northwest Company was actually located out of Montreal. And the Hudson Bay Company was started in England. So they were in competition with one another. And they would be right across the river from one another. And as the fur traders came in, sometimes they weren't sure which trading post to actually go to. But my first grandfather, Thomas Vincent, he actually went through the list of all the postmasters and made that decision as to who would be kept, either the Hudson Bay or the Northwest Company. He worked his way up. He eventually became a governor for the Hudson Bay Company as well. Sadly, when he retired, though, he went back to England, and he did leave his family behind. And that was the one thing with the Hudson Bay Company. A lot of the men that came from England, when they came, they had their career here as a fur trader, or as a postmaster, or an explorer, but then they went back to Europe to retire. And that is what my first grandfather did. He actually abandoned his family here. But the Hudson Bay Company garnished the wages of their employees that did that. So even though he left, my grandmother, who was left here with her children, who were adults by that point, but was left here, the Hudson Bay actually continued to take care of them. Down the fur trade, there was a lot of travel involved, and the traveling was quite different than the travel that we do. And canoes that were used, not the canoes that we see today where one or two people fit in them quite comfortably. These canoes were quite large. They were intended to carry a lot of supplies out that would be traded for the furs, and then as the furs were gathered, they would be brought back to the trading post and then shipped back overseas. It was heavy and hard work. As you can see, there's 6 men carrying this one canoe, but the canoe didn't just have the men in it. It also had all these supplies. And here's an example of some of the supplies that would have been in a canoe. And when you think of the men of the fur trade, you usually think of big burly men who were strong. Now, it is true that they had to be strong, but one of the requirements to be a good fur trader actually was to be a man of small stature. The smaller you were, the less space you took in the canoe, and therefore there was more room for supplies, more room for the furs to come back. So yes, you had to be strong, you had to be small, you had to be a good singer. The men would entertain themselves by singing to keep pace as they were canoeing, but it would also keep them entertained throughout the day. Oftentimes they would be canoeing for 16 hours with very short breaks during the day, and then a very short nighttime as far as having rest, and then they would be up before the sun rose again and back on the waterways. So this is the type of canoe that was used around the Niagara area. In Manitoba, coming from Churchill, coming down, there was a different kind of boat. It was known as the York boat, but very, very similar as far as how it looks. And again, you can see this is an actual photograph, and the York boat is totally full. The men are surrounded by the supplies on both sides of them. Once you got past the waterways, you had to find another way of travel. And so the Red River cart, especially on the prairies, became the main mode of transportation. An ox was a stronger animal than a horse, but a horse could certainly be used. But if you had the ability to get an ox, you would be able to carry much more supplies with you. The Red River cart was completely made out of wood. There were no nails, there was no metal holding it together. As you can see on the wheels of this cart, they're actually quite loaded with mud. And that was one of the problems on the prairies. The prairie dust was so thick that it would start to gather and collect on the wheels. It made it very difficult for travel. But because of that, they couldn't lubricate the axles of these carts. And so it was wood on wood that was rubbing. And apparently it made sound, and it could be heard for kilometers off in the distance as a cart was moving along. The last buffalo hunt that happened around 1875, there were over 1,000 Red River carts that went out together for part of the buffalo hunt. The Maytee were really well known for the buffalo hunt, so were the First Nation people, but the Maytee had access to the rifles. They had access to the horses earlier than what the First Nations people did. They were skilled marksmen as far as their shooting skills and their riding skills. And as the fur trade dwindled down, many of the Metis ended up working in rodeos. Wild Bill Hickok's shows were often filled with Metis men and women because they had the riding and the sharpshooting skills that was entertaining. The buffalo herds at the time were in the millions. I've heard stories that one train got stopped, and as one herd went across the train tracks, it was more than 9 hours of a single herd going animal after animal across the train, and they had to, or across the tracks, and they had to wait for it. So the Metis are really known for the buffalo hunt. The land that my in-laws are on is actually part of a buffalo jump. And so my father-in-law over the years has actually collected quite a few Indian arrowheads, spearheads. He even found a sack of pemmican, and pemmican is made out of dried buffalo meat. When you think about a buffalo being about 2,000 pounds, and again, not necessarily having the machinery that we have today to move an animal of that size, how do you actually take a 2,000 pound animal and get it back to your community? And it wasn't just one buffalo that was collected. As the Metis went out, they would survey their community. And if there were widows with children or elderly or someone who had a disability and couldn't go out as part of the buffalo hunt, the community would actually hunt and bring back food and furs for those that stayed behind. So you've got multiple animals that you're harvesting. And so how do you bring them back? So the First Nation people were the ones who started this, and that was they dried the meat after they captured the animals. They dried the meat, they pounded it down, turned it into almost like a flour. And then they, using every part of the animal, they actually took the fat from the animal and the marrow from the bones, and they mixed that with that powdered meat. And were able to take a 2,000 pound bull and convert it down to a 90 pound sack of pemmican, and made it much easier to transport and bring back home. Pemmican is high in energy, high in nutrients. It was actually probably one of the very first power bars that was used. But if you buried your pemmican in the ground, put it in the sack or put it in the stomach of the buffalo, and then put it in the ground, apparently it would last for up to 50 years and still be something that you could eat. My father-in-law did find a sack of pemmican on the property, chose not to taste it. He wasn't sure how long it was actually there. Some of the symbols that the Metis people are known. If you go to an event and you see someone wearing a sash like any one of these that's in this picture here, it's probably someone who's of Metis heritage. But the Metis are not the only ones who actually use sashes. There are certain First Nations who also wear sashes. But the Metis, that's one of the distincting factors that you can identify someone who probably is of Metis heritage. The colors and patterns were very much a family thing, and when there were gatherings, you could tell who was related to one another because the family would have a certain pattern, and everyone in the family would have the same pattern, or they would all be wearing a sash of the same color. And today, when you see many Metis, you'll see them wearing a red sash. That's one that's been around for a long time and has been mass produced for a long time. So it's the one that's used the most. But in Ontario here, we've actually, we have 9 different regions across the province in Ontario, and each region has its own colored sash. So when we do get together for annual general meetings, you can tell who's from the different parts of the province based on the color of sash that they wore. The sash was not only decorative, it was used to hold their coats closed. Buttons were not necessarily something that were plenty, so the sash would be used to hold the coats closed. They'd be used as a belt. There weren't a lot of pockets in the pants or the breechcloths that the men were wearing at the time, so the sash would be a ready pocket that could travel with them. It was also a first aid kit. If they injured themselves, it could be used as a tourniquet. It could be used to as a brace. It could be used as a sling. So there were many reasons of using the sash for get. It was also used, the men, as they were carrying those canoes, and those canoes filled with supplies. As they were traveling across the land, so they were using the canoes in the waterway, but when they hit land, they had to carry everything. And the process was carrying the canoe first, then carrying the supplies. Each man was required to carry a minimum of 180 pounds for every leg of the trip. Some men were known to carry as much as 450 pounds. So again, a little bit of bravismo or machism as far as trying to outdo one another. So with that though, there were a lot of back injuries and there was tendency for hernias. So the sash also had a practical purpose, that it actually would help support the back, would also help hold in the hernia. So the sash is something that is definitely a part of the fur trade, definitely part of the Metis. Today, if you see people wearing it, the men wear them around their waists in the traditional way. Women often wear them across their shoulder. And another purpose for the sash when women carry them that way is actually it allows them to cradle a child or a baby. And so that's the reason why women carry or wear it across their shoulders. It's said that if it's tied to the left, it means you're married. If it's tied to the right, it means you're single. So when you're getting together for those gatherings, those dances, you could tell who you're related to based on the pattern, based on the color. You could tell who was married or who was attached based on what side that was tied. So a lot of practical purposes. In those canoes, again, the men had to be small. There had to be a lot of space for supplies and for the furs. And they needed to entertain themselves. And so music was a big part of it. And so anything that was small and easily transported was preferred. So the fiddle was and is part of Métis heritage. It is a traditional violin if you actually look at it, but it's the way that it is played. They actually add in an extra beat. Now, I'm not a musician, so I don't quite understand this, but there is an extra beat added into the song. And that creates a whole unique sound of music. And with that, it's a faster pace than what traditional songs are. So the Métis fiddle is a big part of who the Métis people are. With the fiddle goes the dancing. Gatherings that would happen. The men, as they gathered together on the waterways, or as they crossed the land, and as they met up with one another, there would be great celebrations. And even if it was just the men at the time, the men would bring out the music and they would dance. But when they were in their own communities and they were celebrating the men coming back from being out on the trap lines, there would be these celebrations. And the Métis were known to be real party people. In fact, oftentimes what would happen is the furniture would be taken out of the house and a big celebration would happen inside the home. And it didn't just go for a few hours, it would actually go for days on end. So when you were invited for a party, you knew that you were gone for a few days at a time, and a lot of dancing, a lot of jigging was going on. The Métis are known for their beadwork. Traditionally, Indigenous people like to decorate their clothes. It was a fashion statement for them. It was a pride thing as well, as far as, you know, wanting to look good. Doesn't matter who you are, you want to make sure you look good. But the Métis, because they had access to European trade and because of the fur trade, they had access to glass beads. And so while many of the First Nations and even the first Métis would use natural items such as shells or feathers or seeds or nuts to decorate their clothes, or porcupine quills, they were much more natural looking. But when the European trade came and these glass beads came, all of a sudden there were these vibrant colors that could be added to the clothes. And where porcupine quills are very rigid and you know, straight in line, if you look at many of the designs that are First Nation designs, they're geometric in shape, and that's in part because of the materials that they used. But these beads allowed you to create any shape, any design. And the Métis are not only known for our sashes, but we're also known for our beadwork. And so the Metis would bead everything they owned, their hats, their coats, their vests, their shoes. If they had a horse, their saddles would be beaded. If they had dogs, the dogs' harnesses would also be beaded. And so they're quite colorful. Oftentimes the Métis were referred to as the peacocks of the prairie because all of a sudden there was this explosion of color that was being worn on the clothes. This is actually one of my paintings, and I tried to do beadwork. Oops. But I wasn't able to do the beading. So I discovered this form of art. And actually what it is I use the quill end of a feather, and I draw my picture out first using chalk, and then I fill it in dot by dot by dot, creating the image that you saw on the previous slide. So that's my way of celebrating my heritage through my art. The Métis national flag, it predates any other national flag on this land by more than 150 years. Nobody's sure exactly when it was first used, but it was around 1807, I think, was one of the first times that the flag was seen. It is an infinity symbol. There's two things with that. A lot of Métis are actually of English or Scottish heritage, and the Scottish flag is actually a blue flag with an X through it, a white X through it. And so some say that the infinity symbol adaptation of that X of the flag and created this new image. What it actually refers to is the two nations, the European and the First Nations coming together, creating the Métis people. And the infinity symbol means forever. So the Métis people are here forever. So that's what it stands for. You'll see a couple of different colors of flags. Blue is the one that's used most predominantly. It's used definitely in Ontario. A red flag is also sometimes used. There was some talk at one point that the Northwest Company had a blue flag and the Hudson Bay had a red flag. So as I said, as the fur traders were coming up and there was the two trading posts on either side of the river, you didn't know which trading post you had your contract with, or you knew which one you had your contract with, but you didn't know which one was that company. And so the flag that was flown would identify whether it was a Northwest Company, the blue flag, or Hudson Bay Company, the red flag. That's one theory. We have no real proof that that's, a lot of our records have disappeared, so we actually don't know if that's the reality. Another theory is that it depended on the materials that were available at the time. As the ships were coming from Europe, sometimes there was excess blue, so they made blue flags. There was excess red, they made red flags. As the Métis people, we're just glad that they didn't bring a lot of tartan and have excess tartan. Otherwise, we'd also have the infinity symbol on tartan as well. Oops. So I mentioned before that the Métis were known as the rainbow people. We've been referred to as half-breeds, country born. That was the way we were referred to actually in the very beginning. There wasn't an actual name for this new type of people that were being created. But what was happening was, as these families were being formed, the Europeans that were on the land didn't necessarily want to mingle with these mixed bloods or half-breeds. So those families started to pull apart and be on their own. Their First Nation relatives were of the same thought process. The children that were coming out of these unions were learning to read. They were learning the ways of their fathers. So they weren't necessarily accepted within the First Nations. And so more and more these mixed bloods started to move into their own communities. And that's truly where the Metis Nation started. That's where the Metis communities started to form. It was really because there were people that neither side wanted. The First Nations didn't want, the Europeans didn't want. So they started to gather together and create their own communities. But over the time, we were known as the Voyageurs, the Montreal men, Northmen, Coeur de Bois, Bois Brûlé. The dark skin is burnt wood is what that refers to. We were known as the flower bead people because of the beadwork. The rainbow people because because of the mixed heritage that we have, we often have different, we don't just necessarily have the brown eyes of our Indigenous ancestors. We don't have necessarily the black hair or the dark hair of our Indigenous ancestors. So there are many Métis who are light-skinned, like myself, light eyes, and a lighter hair color. One of my sons is blonde. My cousins are all blonde. So they were known as the rainbow people because we came in all different shapes, sizes, and colors. We were also known as the road allowance people, and I'll touch on that in just a little bit. That one was a dark part of the Métis people's history. The gentleman Louis Riel is known as a Métis leader. He was French. He did spend some of his time in Montreal. He had his education in Montreal. He was set to become a lawyer, but his father, who was also Louis Riel, passed away at an early age. So Louis gave up his education, went back to Manitoba to look after his family. He became very involved with the Métis community, but also with the Indigenous community or the First Nations community in Manitoba. And he started to see that as the Europeans were coming onto the land, there was a lot of things weren't necessarily working out fairly. And so he was looking out for the underdog of the time, and that included the Métis as well as the First Nation people. Over time, he led to resistances against the Canadian government. As a result, Sir John A. Macdonald hated Louis Riel. Louis fought for the rights of the Métis people. He was actually elected to Parliament. As Canada was formed, he was elected 3 different times to become a parliamentarian. One of the requirements to be in Parliament is you have to go to the building and there's a registry that you have to sign. Sir John A. Macdonald hated him so much there was a $5,000 price tag on his head. And so he wasn't able to openly go and participate in Parliament, but he did sneak in. So if you go to the Parliament buildings and get them to flip back the registry back to the 1870s, you'll actually see Louis Riel's signature there. He did have a $5,000 bounty on his head, so eventually he did go down to to Montana. He went down to the United States to escape the Canadian government with that bounty on his head. But before that happened, he was very much a part of Manitoba joining Confederation. So in 1870, Manitoba was not the key-shaped province that we see today. It was the postage stamp province, so significantly smaller than what we're used to. But in that small piece of land, there were 10,000 Métis people who had schools, had businesses, who had homes. And as Canada was expanding and the province of Manitoba was being created, the surveyors from the government were coming in and taking away the land of the Métis people. And so Louis Riel tried the political route, but also ended up with a little bit of gunpowder or gunfire behind him as well, with 2 different resistances, one in Manitoba, one in Saskatchewan as it moved further west. So Manitoba right now, this year in 2020, is celebrating 150 years of Confederation. And sadly, when the province was starting to organize the celebrations, there was no involvement of the Métis, and there was no mention of Louis Riel at the time. Now, I understand that that's changed, but that does show that some of the hard feelings of who Louis Riel is and is still around today. You know, again, it goes back to, was he a hero or was he a traitor? There is talk of having him named as a father of Confederation, because Manitoba would not have actually been formed as a province if it wasn't for Louis Riel. There was a good chance that the United States would have taken over that land. And because of the efforts of Louis Riel and his government that he had formed in Manitoba, he was actually able to hold off the US and formed that alliance with Canada and created Manitoba as part of Confederation. After that, though, he did go down to Montana. The price tag was still on his head. He lived down there. He was a teacher in Montana, but as Canada was moving further and further west, now they were into Saskatchewan. And another Métis leader, Gabriel Dumont, was trying to resist the Canadian government from taking over the land and taking over the property of the Métis people. So he called down to Montana and he asked Louis Riel to come back. And so Louis did come back, and he was part of what is known as the Battle of Batoche, Saskatchewan. It was a small community. It was a farming community. There was a church right near where the battle took place. The first round of battle, the Métis actually were in the lead. But Sir John A. Macdonald was not going to be held back by the Métis. He had his plan of a coast-to-coast Canada. He was bringing across the railway. And so the Métis were in his way. And Louis Riel, for the second time, was battling him. So in this poster, you can see there's actually a Gatling gun or a machine gun. And that is the first time a Gatling gun or a machine gun was used on the land known as Canada. It was used against the Métis people. And when the Canadian government sent the troops from Ontario into Manitoba, or into Saskatchewan, sorry, to battle the Métis, they were given approval to kill any Métis they came across. They were given approval to take any property or any land as spoils of the battle. And so a lot of property was actually taken from the Métis at the time. And in fact, there's a legion here in Ontario that up until recently had the church bell from the battlegrounds in Saskatchewan. They actually brought it back to Ontario, ended up in one of the legions. And contingency from the west of Métis came and asked for it back, and the legion refused to give it to them. Oddly enough, it disappeared shortly after that visit, and there's rumor that it shows up at Jubilees in Western Canada. So I think we know exactly what happened there. But after the Battle of Batoche, the Métis went into hiding. The Canadian government really, again, wanted nothing to do with Louis Riel. They wanted nothing to do with the Métis. And so it was hard to find work. Nobody wanted to hire someone who was Métis. Their land was taken away, so they no longer had their homes. And as a result of that, many of the Métis ended up living along the road allowances or in the ditches. As the roads were being developed in Western Canada, or as the railway was moving across the country, there was government land that was set aside. So oddly enough, even though the Canadian government didn't want the Métis ended up squatting on this road allowance land. And this is an image from one of the communities living in a tent or a very small shack. At the Battle of Batoche, when the Gatling gun was used, Louis Riel actually handed himself in. He turned himself in. He was tried for treason. He was tried by a jury. The jury found him guilty of treason, but they asked for leniency. The judge who oversaw the trial wanted leniency. But again, Sir John A. Macdonald hated Louis Riel, saw him as a barrier to the coast-to-coast Canada. And so it was Sir John A. Macdonald who actually insisted on the death penalty of Louis Riel. And so the Battle of Batoche happened in the summer of 1885. The trial started in July, in the summer of 1885, and he was hanged on November 16th, 1885. So in Ontario, we have what we refer to as Louis Riel Day, and that is November 16th, the day that Louis Riel was actually hung. Now, at his trial, one of the things that he said was that my people will sleep for 100 years, but when they awake, it will be the artists who give them their spirits, or bring back their spirits. So as an artist myself, I take this as a message to me specifically, but it was amazing how close he was to what actually happened. The Métis did go into hiding. Again, no one wanted to hire them. Getting land was very, very difficult at the time. The First Nation people had treaties, they had reserves, they had the Indian Act, even as oppressive as it was, it did provide some funding for those who were treaty Indians. But the Métis had nothing. And so they did go into hiding. And so people like my ancestors, who some of them have the lighter skin, the lighter hair, they blended in with Europeans, and so that's where they went. Some of our other relatives blended in more with their First Nations, and so they actually ended up going back to the reserves. And so many Métis have actually disappeared because they're part of the reserves today. But it wasn't until 110 years later that the Metis Nation of Ontario actually formed. So that was 1996. So almost 100 years, as Louis said, the Métis people went into hiding, disappeared from the history of Canada. People did not want to identify that they were of Métis heritage. And in fact, my own family situation was that I was not told until I was an adult that I had Métis heritage. My mother, this was something that she kept, my uncles all kept as a family secret because we did fit in with the Europeans. And so there was no need to draw attention to us. But there was also probably some fear because right up until 1996, the Indian residential schools were in place. And so oddly enough, it was actually 1996 that my mother actually shared with me of my Métis heritage. So whether that had anything to do with the Indian residential schools closing at the time, I'm not exactly sure. The Métis people, according to Stats Canada, we're just under 600,000 people in this land known as Canada. In the province of Ontario, we're about 121,000 people who identify as Métis. We are the largest population of Métis in the province of Ontario. Oddly enough, Manitoba, which is known as the homeland of the Métis, only today has a 15% share of the Métis population. Between the census in 2006 and 2016, the Métis numbers increased by 50%. And again, that was after the time that the Metis Nation of Ontario formed. It was at the time when the Métis were starting to come out of hiding. And so those numbers prove that we were here, we just didn't acknowledge who we were at, prior to that. The Metis Nation of Ontario, it is a government within the province. We have 9 different regions across the province, so there are representatives from each of the regions that are part of the provincial council. We have a president, a chair, a vice chair, secretary. There are 4 senators, which are elders or spiritual leaders for the Métis people, and so they're part of the provincial council as well. We have a president. In fact, this past month was our election, so Margaret Froh was president previously and has been re-elected back in, so congratulations to Margaret. She is our leader for the province. We have about 160 people who work for the Métis Nation of Ontario, providing all types of services from land rights to health services to education. So we have about 32 different offices across the province, and there are staff in each of those offices, and they are providing services to the local communities. If you are Métis right now under the COVID situation, we do have money that we are handing out food gift cards. So if you are Métis and have a Métis citizenship number, get in touch with me and I can put you in touch with the individual who's overseeing some of the food gift cards that are being dispersed out by the Métis Nation of Ontario. Locally here, we have the Niagara Region Métis Council. I am the chair of that council. We have 12 members on council. We meet monthly. We do all types of things, everything from school and community presentations like the one we're doing tonight. We do workshops where we learn how to do the dot art. We learn how to make drums. We learn how to make moccasins. So we try to bring in the youth, we try to bring in the elders, and you do not have to be Métis to participate in our workshops. If you hear about one of our workshops, you're more than welcome to come and join and celebrate our history and our heritage with us. We have a couple of celebrations, our harvest dinner and our fish fry. And if you go to Fort Erie or Fort George in the summertime, you may see a group of people like in this photograph here, and that is us. We actually live the life of the Métis around 1812, and actually have our teepee and cook over an open fire. It's a great time. We participate in parades. There's a couple of workshops that we do. Again, we also try to encourage our youth, and in fact, every couple of years, a group of youth get to go on. It's a huge canoe trip, and so the photograph on the left is actually some of the youth that participated in that. It's actually, I think, a 3-month journey that they're on, and they live the life of the voyageur or of the Métis at the turn of this 18th century. A couple of legal things as far as who the Métis are. As you know, in the Niagara area, there is the right to hunt in short hills, but that is something that is available for First Nations. The Métis at one point lost their harvesting rights, but a family in Sault Ste. Marie, the Pauli family, they actually went hunting and harvested a moose, and they left their Métis card on the moose and said, we'll be back to pick it up after. Again, moose is a big, heavy animal. You can't, if you walked into the woods, you can't necessarily walk out with your moose. You have to come back with a way to take it out. So they left identification on the moose, and the game warden came across it and followed up and actually arrested father and son for harvesting out of season. So the Metis Nation of Ontario actually stood behind the Pauli family, and it was a lengthy battle because that started in 1993, and finally in 2003, so 20 years later, the Supreme Court of Canada actually acknowledged that the Métis, under Canada's Constitution, are Aboriginals, are Indigenous people, therefore have harvesting rights. And so therefore, the case against the Paulis were dropped, and it is now known as the Pauli decision, and the Métis have the right to actually harvest, but we can only harvest in our traditional lands. So Niagara is not a traditional land for the Métis, so we can't participate in the Short Hills hunt or any hunting in this part of the province. I'm not a hunter, but my sons are interested. They have to go up north in order to actually exercise their harvesting rights. Another court case that went through, and again, it took a long time. In this case, it took 17 years. Harry Daniels was a leader in the Indigenous community, and he is Maytee. So like Louis Riel, he wasn't just fighting for the rights of the Maytee. In this case, Harry Daniels was fighting for the rights of the Maytee, but also the First Nation people who were not treaty Indians. If you don't have your treaty number, your treaty rights, then you don't get some of the benefits, some of the services that the federal government provides for the First Nations. And so Harry Daniels fought for the rights of Metis and the non-status First Nations individuals. And it was a 17-year battle. Every court agreed with the Daniels decision, but it took the Supreme Court of Canada on April 14th in 2016 when they finally ruled that enough is enough. The Métis are in Canada's Constitution as one of the free nations. And in fact, at this point now, the Métis are classified under Canada's Constitution as Indian. We're not affected by the Indian Act. That's something that separates us from our First Nations brothers and sisters, but we are now actually classified as Indian under the Daniels ruling by the Supreme Court of Canada. Now, harvesting rights, our ability to bring in food, look after our families is one thing. The Daniels case was about education. It was about benefits. It was about services that were available for the Métis people. And one of the ones that is the most heart-wrenching for me is our veterans. So if you were First Nations and if you went to war, First World War, Second World War, any of the other conflicts, you came back, and there's a whole other conversation that can go with that, but you were covered under federal services as a veteran if you were First Nations. If you were Métis, the federal government at the time refusing to acknowledge the Métis people. So we had the Constitution, we were accepted there, we were winning these Supreme Court rulings, but the government of Canada was still not accepting the Métis. They were saying you're a provincial organization, so therefore the province will look after you. But what that did was our veterans never received any benefits or any services after they served for this country. And so this photograph here is from last summer. This gentleman is 107 years old. He received his very first Métis Veterans Benefit in August of 2019. So that's one of the things that the Daniels case has done. And since then, there's been about a dozen of our veterans who have received their first checks in this past year. But again, if we're talking World War II veterans, there's not many around now. So it's good that we're moving ahead, but it's sad what has happened to our veterans. The last thing that I want to bring up as far as any rulings that are happening in Canada, last June, in June of 2019, almost a year ago today, 3 provinces, Ontario, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, sat down with the federal government and we signed an agreement. And so the federal government is actually allowing for us to develop our own self-government. With that, there will be our ability to control what happens to our family and child services. It'll help us with our healthcare, with our education, with our veterans. But it'll give the control back to the Métis people. So this is actually the signing with Minister Bennett last June, and the presidents of the 3 provinces who actually signed the agreement. And so we don't have self-government yet, but we're moving towards that. We're working towards that. And so that's an exciting time. I'm done with the history of who the Métis are. The rest are actually just images of my artwork. We'll just scroll through. I do use my art as a way of educating people wherever possible. So I do talk about the beadwork, and I talk about the history of the Métis through that. Some of these are of personal purposes. This one I actually show because I made a boo-boo and had to repaint over top of it. So you see the before and after. So it's the same picture, but I use different colors. This is actually my tribute to the Indian residential schools. It's actually, if you look at this image, it is all flowers, but it's based on this photograph. And so when you look at the picture, you can see where the nuns are located in my picture by the black and white flowers. There's also crosses hanging from those flowers. The children in my pictures are pastel colors, and every flower is different to show the uniqueness and the fragility of the child. What is difficult to see in the right-hand corner is actually a Dreamcatcher, and it's painted orange on orange, and that's showing that their heritage and their history is disappearing on them. And at the bottom, there is a treaty that was put together between the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch in the 1600s. It was known as the Two World Wampum. And basically what it says is that the Europeans will travel in their canoe, their waterways, and the First Nations, the Haudenosaunee, will travel in theirs, and they will not interfere with each other's lives. So I put that at the bottom of this painting as that was the promise in the 1600s, but the reality was the Indian residential schools. Murdered and missing Indigenous women, there's over 1,200 that the Canadian government and the RCMP and police were not investigating. So there's something known as the Red Dress Project. So this is my painting that goes to the Red Dress Project. This is the one that's actually in the legislature at Queen's Park right now. They wanted the painting that was the Indian residential school painting, but it has a story to go with it, and they wouldn't allow me to tell the whole story. So I said, you can't have that painting. So I gave them this one instead. This one's my tribute to Louis Riel. So that's my inside joke against the way that the government has treated Louis Riel in the past. He's actually proudly on display in Queen's Park as we speak. And I do go out into community. I do a lot of workshops teaching people about the Métis people, but also the style of art known as dot art. So actually with that, I'm gonna end my talking. I'm gonna get rid of, I think, get rid of that screen. And if there are any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them. Or if any discussion.
Thank you so much, Brian, for sharing. That was amazing. We do have a question from Facebook, and they ask, how did the word Métis come about?
So Métis is actually a French word. A lot of people, when they think of Métis, they think Métis are a mix of the French and Indigenous people. And the word Métis is actually a French word, and that means mixed. But over time, that definition has disappeared, and it's stuck or been applied to this new Aboriginal people. I have to admit, in the past, whenever I talked about who the Métis were, I really spoke about the coming together of the two worlds, the old world, the Europeans, and the new world and First Nations people. But as I go on my journey, I see more and more people who are of First Nation heritage who are also of mixed heritage. So truly, we formed as a nation more than 150 years before Canada became a country. And so we truly are first people of this land in our own right. So this whole concept of mixing is starting to wane away. It's not as relevant, but Metis does mean a mixing.
Well, thank you so much for that. And I definitely really want to encourage our attendees, if you have any questions on anything that Brian has mentioned and talked about, please up in the Q&A, please ask. Where can young people find information about the events you mentioned?
So we do have a Facebook page, Niagara Region Metis Council. You can look on there. That's probably our most current form of online messaging. We do have a website as well. I'm in charge of the website and I'm not very good at keeping it updated. So I always encourage people to go to our Niagara Region Metis Council Facebook page, and we post everything there. A lot of the resources are also passed on through the schools. I do work for a school board now. I'm an Indigenous lead for the Catholic School Board, but I have an equivalent with the public board, District School Board of Niagara. And so a lot of events, whether it's through the Niagara Region Metis Council or whether it's through either the friendship centers that are in the area, the Fort Erie Native Friendship Center or the Niagara Regional Native Center, a lot of that is actually shared through the schools as well.
Okay. We have another one here. What do you think about the issues between the MNC and MNO?
Okay. Yeah, it's unfortunate that what has happened. For those that don't know, every province has its own government. So we had the Metis Nation of Ontario. There's the Manitoba Federation of Maytee in Manitoba. Saskatchewan has theirs. Alberta, British Columbia has theirs. But then there's a body that oversees all of them. And it's an additional entity. So with the federal government, Ontario, Saskatchewan, Alberta have signed on with the federal government to go towards self-government. Manitoba, British Columbia, and the Metis Nation of Canada has held back. It's political. It's not looking at the citizens the way that it should. Yeah.
Okay. We do have another question here as well. Post Daniel's decision, what kind of political determination goals do Métis people have?
Our goals? Well, again, the biggest thing for us right now is actually this self-government. And it will happen for those other provinces and for the National Council as well. We just had a gathering, 3 provinces got together just before the pandemic shut down. We were in Quebec. 3 provinces did meet together. We met with lawyers. We met with representatives from all the provinces. We met with representatives from the federal government. And so all of us will be impacted by this eventually, but for now, it's only those first 3 provinces who actually have the documentation in place. But self-government is really where we're headed. And with self-government, that does, Métis up until now has never received any federal funding. So where the Inuit have funding, where the First Nations have funding for education, for family and child services, for healthcare, the Métis have never had any of that. So as we look towards our self-government, there will be financial support that goes to the provinces. And so as you can see, there's a lot of gray in the beard. As I age, I look forward to the fact that I may actually have some health benefits moving forward. But none of that's in place yet. So we have the document where the federal government has agreed and these provinces have agreed to come together to talk and work towards self-government. But what that actually is, it has not been finalized. But those are the main things: education, healthcare, family services. Those are the main things that we're looking at to make sure that we can be an independent people and be proud of who we are.
Okay, we have another Facebook question. If a Métis marries a non-Indigenous person, will the children still be considered Métis?
If either of the parents are Métis, then yes. So within, I'll only speak for Ontario, but I think the other provinces are very similar. But in Ontario, you do have to, socially you can self-identify that you're Métis, and that's acceptable. But as the self-government is moving forward, as some of the federal funding is coming forward, one of the things that we're doing is making sure that people aren't just jumping onto the bandwagon. So there is documentation that is required. And it's not perfect because the Métis are known as ambulatory people. We don't normally just sit. Historically, we traveled across the land. And so there's some issues with that. My ancestors started in Moose Factory, which is Ontario. They ended up in Manitoba. That's where I grew up. That's where I was raised. I thought I was a Manitoba Métis. Now I find out I'm actually an Ontario Métis. As long as you've got that documentation, and to be Métis, it's that historic documentation. So prior to colonization or prior to Confederation, one of the things that the Metis Nation of Ontario has done, so my genealogy goes back more than 7 generations. And because of who my grandfather was with Hudson Bay Company, he's well documented. But not everybody has that. And so I was able to go back easily and trace back to the 1700s. What the Metis Nation of Ontario has done is they've put together a registry. They started with 100 families. And with that, there's the tree limb effect of a family tree, right? So all you have to do is trace your heritage back to one of those families. So you may only have to go back 2 or 3 generations, but that will then lead you back the 7 or 8 or 9 generations prior to that. So that's one of the things that the Metis Nation of Ontario has done. But unlike with First Nations, where there were some issues that if a First Nation woman married a non-Native man, she lost her status at one point, whereas a non-Native woman marrying a Native man all of a sudden had status. The Métis were never part of that. So it's that genealogy, it's that history, it's that timeline of before Confederation that you're looking for.
All right, thank you so much. Just wondering if there's any more questions out there. Within the meantime, oops, I don't know what happened there. Okay. Well, Brian, thank you so much for sharing. You taught me a lot just within this session, and I really appreciate it. And I'm sure a lot of our viewers and our attendees think the same way. And, we just learned a lot within this session. And we definitely really appreciate you. And I'm glad to call you a friend as well. And, thank you so much.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it. One of my challenges with this, I'm an animated speaker. So to sit in a chair and do this presentation was really holding me back. But it was an honor to be given the opportunity to share. My contact information, I'm sure, is available alongside of this presentation in some way. So if anyone does have any specific questions that they didn't want to ask during this session, I'd be more than happy to answer. And again, the school systems are really changing how they're looking at Indigenous heritage and culture. And where, when I grew up, we didn't talk about Indians. But today, the history of the Indigenous people is making its way into the curriculum. And I'm proud to be a part of that.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you so much. And on a side note, for our viewers, we would just like to thank you for being with us tonight. And if you go onto the Niagara Falls History Museum.ca site, we have the Empathic Traditions Collection site design, as well as many more interactions that you can do online. There's quite a few there, so please check them out. As well as I want to hope that you guys would join us next week. Next week we have Grandmother Renee Thomas Hill. She will be joining us, and just a little bit of what she had wrote to us I'm going to share with you. These are her words. I was told as a young girl by my great-grandfather, you're going to teach, but you're going to teach a different vision. My dad also told me early on, you will have many jobs, many careers, many hats. And these prophecies came to pass. I was always proud to be Indigenous. Today I have my voice and use it to share my awareness and uplift the spirit through the teachings of our mother, the earth, and the understanding of a good mind. And she is going to be here to share with us next Thursday evening. So please, please join us on that night as well, and as well as walking through this speaker series all together. It's a great journey, and we're going to learn a lot. And we really appreciate, so the Niagara Falls History Museum really appreciates everyone coming to join us. And if you have some friends that are interested in conversations after this as well, please let them know that the 4 Direction Speaker Series is on, and it's a great way to learn. And thank you so much again, Brian. Definitely really appreciate everything that you taught us tonight. And I would like to say goodbye to everyone that joined us, and hopefully you join us next week. Have a great night. Take care. See you next Thursday. Bye.